Right now, I'd like to get us started by welcoming Dr. Ed Penhote to join me up here. Ed has been actively engaged in biomedical innovation through his entire career. Most recently, as I mentioned a minute ago, as director with Alta Partners, a life science venture capital firm, as well as in his service on PCAST. Ed's extensive experiences also include his role as founder and president of Chiron, as well as being the immediate past dean of the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley and a member of Berkeley's biochemistry department. Ed's also a member of the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences, and he's authored over 50 scientific articles and papers. So a unique combination of perspectives and background that really make it him the right person to kick off this event today. Please join me in welcoming Ed Penhote.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Well, thanks to all of you for coming today. And while we're thanking people, let me thank my co-chairs, Eric Lander, who is the co-chair of PCAST, Chris Castle, who is a physician at the American College of Physicians, and Rick Levin, the president of Yale, all of whom were co-chairs of the study with me at PCAST. And special thanks to Amber Hartman-Schultz, who's right back here. Amber is the executive director of PCAST at the present time and did yeoman service on this project. Much of what I'm going to say earlier in this talk has already been said by Mark, but let me re-emphasize a few points. First of all, let me start with a personal disclaimer. As you know, the president has had a number of other things on his mind for the last few months, so we have not had the opportunity to brief the president on the PCAST study. We hope to do that next week at the PCAST meeting upcoming, but as such, there's no official response from the administration to our study. Having said that, the FDA has been a participant in this study from the beginning at many different levels and was an important source of generative ideas for the study, especially Janet Woodcock, Vicky Seifert-Margolis, and of course, the commissioner herself, Peggy Hamburg. So the FDA has been a very important part of this, but as I said, we do not have the official response from the president's office because we haven't had a chance to brief him on this report at this particular time. As Mark emphasized, this meeting is an open meeting, and I want to start again by saying whatever I say today is my own personal opinions. I will read some parts of the report to you and try to give you a sense of how the report came about going forward, but I in no sense represent the administration or the rest of PCAST in my remarks today. Mark alluded to the economic problem that we're facing. To some degree, it has multiple roots as we speak. Part of the problem, I think, is the current paradigm for drug development has two different sources of cost embedded in it. We are simultaneously trying to develop drugs with new technology and new knowledge and a lot of new information. But that new information is not adequate many times to actually address all of the concerns about a new drug that might enter the marketplace. So at the same time we're using the new technology and paying for the new technology, we are also using and paying for the old technology, which was essentially to conduct randomized clinical trials and look for outcomes as the gold standard, if you will, pretending that we don't really know very much about how things work. So to some degree, the analogy I use is the situation libraries now face. For those of you who fund libraries, you know that we're still paying for books and we're also paying for online library things. So we got two costs in the library system, and essentially we have two costs here. Total amount of money spent on biomedical R&D in this country is substantial, probably in excess of $120 billion a year, which is somewhat around 7% of the total investment in health is represented in this sector. But the funding for the sector is under stress in every single part of the sector. Mark mentioned the constraints on federal spending, which are in front of us and are real. But in addition to that, the pharmaceutical companies' profit margins are dwindling, and they have already taken steps to reduce their own commitment to R&D in this field going forward. The biotech community is facing a serious decline in the investment in venture capital as we speak, and so there's much less money coming into the generative side of this field going forward. And so each of the key components, if you will, of investment in this field is undergoing economic stress as we speak, and emphasize the need to me to actually think harder about how to get the net return on our investment. And Mark, I like the word you used, impact of our investment, to increase. We simply can't count on spending more money for innovation. We have to get more innovation per dollar going forward. This room was not set up for slides, so for scientists like me, that represents a problem. I'm always used to speaking to slides, but one graphic. The costs are going like this, and the productivity is going like this. It's not sustainable. We have to do something different. So we tried to address some of these issues in working on the problem with PCAST. We were asked by the president actually to look into the drug approval process at the FDA. It became quickly apparent to us that the FDA was the sharp end of the stick, so to speak. At the end of the day, the up or down decision about a new chemical entity entering the marketplace is made by the FDA, but behind that, there's a whole, if you will, infrastructure of other players that lead to the FDA, and the FDA cannot solve this problem by itself. So the problem is a very broad problem, and as a result, we engaged at PCAST a wide variety of participants in our meetings. As I said before, FDA was an important participant. The NIH was present in our meetings. The pharma industry was present. Patient advocates were present. Consumer groups were present. Physicians as a group were represented by Chris Castle, one of our co-chairs of the study, but by a number of other people as well. So our meetings were very broad-based, and we got input from a large cross-section, if you will, of people engaged in the health sector. Several overarching themes emerged as a result of those conversations. First of all, it became clear that better integration of basic science and drug development was crucial. I'm going to return to this theme over and over again, because a lot of the recommendations sort of look to things like accelerated approval, special medical use, et cetera. All of those things depend fundamentally on scientific knowledge of the disease that you're trying to address. And so the basic science is not something that's necessarily for 30 years from now drugs. It's something that's required in the present cycle in order to make the whole system more efficient. Let me give you a couple of examples. One was the development of something called viral load measurement as a way to assess whether drugs were useful for treating AIDS or hepatitis. Viral load measurements essentially tell you how much virus is present in a patient sample. Some very good research by my colleagues at Chiron and by David Ho at Rockefeller University show that the best marker for progression of HIV into AIDS as a disease was viral load measurement, a simple quantitative measurement. Since then, virtually all HIV and HCV drugs have been developed and approved using viral load as a measurement, a simple quantitative measurement that was easy to do. Another more recent example was the approval of an inhibitor of an enzyme called BRAF in melanoma, which was targeted to a specific mutated enzyme that exists in about half the melanoma patients. Again, you can assay drugs against this target, know how it works, and those are just two examples, if you will, of the way basic science facilitates the whole process after that. The second thing is we need dramatically improved performance of clinical trials. The field as a whole, and it's not every clinical trial to be sure, but the field as a whole is marked today by, number one, poor design, number two, long negotiation periods with the organizations that carry out the clinical trials, really cumbersome institutional review board procedures, which are different for every institution carrying out a clinical trial and take a long time, and poor participation by physicians who actually sign up to do the clinical trials. So overall, we have to work really hard to increase both the quality and the productivity of our clinical trials, because this is about where 40% of the total R&D money is spent by the organizations involved in that. And certainly efforts by the NIH and a number of other organizations I'll touch upon later are engaged in that. Again, we have to improve the use of science in the FDA. This is a theme that comes up over and over. And then finally, we recommend much better clarity and guidance in regulatory regimes. Another issue which bedevils the field in many cases. So let me read to you a statement of the goal overall of this study: to double the output of innovative new medicines for patients with important unmet medical needs while increasing drug efficacy and safety through industry, academia, and government working together to decrease clinical failure, clinical trial cost, time to market, and regulatory uncertainty. This is a case where words matter. Let me go back to the beginning. Output of innovative new medicines for patients with important unmet medical needs. This speaks to the issue of impact. We're used to just counting new chemical entities approved by the FDA. Perhaps that's not enough. We should be looking to the substance of what's being approved. Are these things really having an impact on health? So I think we need some new metrics for how well we're doing as a field to look at the impact of the new drugs and therapies that get developed rather than simply counting new chemical entities. The recommendations themselves, and there are 8 of them. First was to support federal initiatives to accelerate therapeutics. Wouldn't be surprising, most studies like ours argue for more money for the NIH, but especially for NCATS, which is a leading organization attempting to enhance the quality and the scope of clinical trials. The second one is to catalyze the creation of a broad-based partnership to accelerate therapeutics. This is an interesting idea. It's going to be challenging in its implementation, and I will return to it later on in my talk this afternoon. It's morning in San Francisco. But perhaps one of the most important recommendations in the long run. But here again, one of the key elements of the partnership is to identify problems and to use the science and development to better facilitate the new drugs. A third one is to improve the drug evaluation process, and the first of those is to expand the use and practice of FDA's existing authorities for accelerated approval and confirmatory evidence. Accelerated approval really means approval of a new chemical entity without thorough and convincing evidence that it's either truly useful or safe in broad populations. It depends on the science being developed to allow the agency and the developers of these new medicines to make a reasoned decision that it makes sense to bring this product to market in the absence of a full-blown clinical outcome study. And again, it's absolutely dependent on the underlying science being well articulated and understood. But this requirement, this essentially urging the FDA to use this pathway more often, also comes with a real obligation, as Mark indicated, to follow up after approval to make sure the drug really does what it says. A recent example of that was the use of VEGF inhibitors, especially Avastin in breast cancer, where it received tentative approval based on early evidence, but then the clinical outcomes remained to be shown. We say the FDA must redouble its efforts to make sure that when it engages pharma partners in doing post-marketing studies, that those actually have teeth in those admonitions, if you will, and that those studies really are done to follow up. Again, key element in accelerated approval, good science that underlies the system. In fact, we go further to recommend a new category called special medical use. This is a case where a new entity would be actually approved only for use in a specific patient population. And the penalties for using it outside that patient population would be, in some cases, severe penalties of one sort or another. Why? Because in current circumstance, if the FDA has reason to believe that a new medicine would be used for in a situation which is not its intended use, it's entirely possible that this misuse of a new medicine will actually cause many more problems in a broader population than the population for which it was intended. And one example people frequently use is obesity. So a drug which might be used for morbidly obese patients who have serious health problems as a result, the risk and benefit of using that for those patients may be quite different than for those of us who would like to use it to go to a college reunion in 3 months. And there's a really important distinction. So we recommend this category, special medical use, to allow the FDA to approve drugs for a specific group of individuals, knowing in so doing that its use beyond that would be severely limited. And today the FDA, if it doesn't have that capability, has to assume it will be used for the college reunion folks and not just for the morbidly obese. So this would help a lot in terms of new approvals by the FDA. Again, it's importantly that it takes the science into account, but brings up another issue. The conversation around safety and efficacy always uses those two words. The public's perception of what the FDA, when the FDA approves something, is that it's both safe and efficacious. We urge in several places that the FDA try to begin a dialogue of changing those terms to a satisfactory benefit and risk ratio. The benefit for whom and the risk for whom. Because it's a very different conversation, and it's in a sense misleading to the public to assume any drug is both safe and fully, most drugs are not efficacious for everybody, and they're not safe for everybody. So a better articulation of risk and benefit rather than safe and efficacious we think would be useful. So the communication is an important element of this. Improving FDA management is another area that we looked into. And, you know, speaking of somebody who ran a biotechnology company for almost 20 years, I can tell you that I hear the same thing from many other people. The most frustrating thing on the part of innovators in the private sector is when the FDA changes its views about what should be done halfway through a study. So we do recommend that the FDA actually appoint a single individual to sort of be the shepherd of an IND through the NDA process, so there's continuity of communication with the companies throughout that process. In addition to that, the FDA has a number of internal things which need a lot of work. The IT systems at FDA are antiquated and need to be beefed up for sure. And we also recommend that they appoint an advisory board for medical products to the FDA to get more direct outside feedback to the FDA. There are a few other recommendations. I think Mark touched on a final one. Look for is there a need for new economic incentives, a longer lifetime of exclusivity for orphan drugs? You know, I don't have the full menu. We didn't come up with a prescription, except that groups like CMS and others should look into these issues to make sure that there are adequate incentives in place to move forward. So that's sort of an overall framework of the recommendations. I didn't just go through every single one. They're all in the handout that you have, and I hope you will take time to read that report. But let's talk for a few minutes now about what's happening as a result of this and other elements and other programs, such as Mark alluded to earlier, that are happening. First of all, what's happening with the FDA? We were really pleased, as I said, to see meaningful, high-level participation by the FDA in all of our meetings that led to the report. Peggy Hamburg herself participated in the rollout of this report at the National Academies now about a month ago. And without embracing every single one of the recommendations, Peggy expressed strong support for the report as a whole. In addition to that, since then, Peggy has expressed strong support for the special medical use category, which may require new legislation in order that we don't think accelerated approval requires new legislation. There's plenty of legislation in place that empowers the FDA to do that. It's under their control. But special medical use, because of its constraints on how a new medicine would be used, would probably need some new legislation. She's, I think the other thing that Peggy has, and this predated our report, but has strongly, essentially recommended and taken action on, is the development of the field called regulatory science. This is a widely misunderstood term. Nobody's quite sure what it means. People usually try to fit it to their own uses, but there is a clear gap today between basic biomedical research, defining fundamental principles, and the drug development process, where targeted, well-articulated, well-conceived studies, using not just molecular biology, but epidemiological principles, the great power in the genomics work that's going on, et cetera, need to be refined and brought forward. And this is the sort of province of regulatory science. It's the science required in order to meet the needs of a regulatory scheme. And the regulatory scheme is not, in a sense, it ends up being a regulatory scenario, as I said, but it's really, what do you need for any reasoned group of people to say, yes, it's possible that you should go forward with this new medicine, this new therapy. So there's a growing, the FDA has invested in some joint education programs throughout the country to enhance this field and move it forward. In a number of other agencies, this is not just a problem with FDA, but many other agencies, how you use nanotechnology products, how you use a whole variety of new innovations in our society really needs a structured approach to actually defining the science required to ensure that products have a beneficial risk and benefit to society. The Partnership for Accelerating Therapeutics is gaining momentum. We're very fortunate that two very important and prestigious organizations have decided to take a leadership role in forming the partnership and in getting it in place. One of those is the Institute of Medicine, and within the structure of the national academies, and the national academies separately. And the second is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, headed by Robert Tejan. Both of these organizations have agreed to collaborate. First of all, to assemble working groups to discuss how this would work, and second of all, to actually bring together an organization which could move this forward. The partnership is, there is a drug forum at the IOM, as many of you know, that deals with some of these problems, especially identifying key needs and opportunities. The vision for the partnership is it goes beyond identifying the needs and actually serves as an honest broker, if you will, to get people to address these things, to work with various different organizations to move key aspects of this forward going in the future. So in addition to identifying, the partnership would prioritize, develop specific solutions and detailed plans, and ensure, as the best it can, that the projects are launched. So this is an organization which will require a staff, which will require funding, and will require the gravitas, if you will, the jawbone, the various different organizations into doing actually carrying out the work, which the partnership won't be able to do. So this is moving along well with as good a sponsors as we could hope. The NIH effort, and we'll hear a lot more about that later today, and the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences is moving along well, but it can't be expected to solve all the problems of clinical trials. It's simply the whole clinical trial enterprise is much larger than any single organization, even the NIH, but so far a very good start on their part. And to quote from Shakespeare, "Misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows." 10 pharma companies have actually formed what's called Transcelerate Pharma to identify and solve common drug development challenges with the end goals of improving the quantity and quality of clinical studies and bringing new medicines to patients faster. A recognition by the pharma companies, it's a bigger problem than any of us have by ourselves. So actually collaborating together in a pre-competitive way Some people term the whole effort as, something like Semitech in the semiconductor industry early on. These problems are big problems and will require many people to engage in their solutions. The FDA and Duke University have founded the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative to essentially work on the clinical trials part of this problem. They say our current system too slow, too expensive, and doesn't answer many critical questions. All of those are true, and so it's really working to improve this. This is a critical issue because the FDA is generally overwhelmed as an agency with work to do. Part of the reason it's overwhelmed, poor quality submissions. People wanting to do stupid things, even wanting to do good things not well described, et cetera. And being a reviewer of lots of different things, I can tell you it's a lot harder to review a lousy paper than a good one. And it's a lot more work for the FDA to actually deal with poor quality submissions than it is with first-rate submissions, which are based on good science, have a straightforward program, easily described endpoints, and a program to put those into place. So it's really a key issue. And then there are other consortia being formed to move clinical trials more rapidly. One of the leading ones is called iSpy. iSpy is a program put together by the FDA, a group at UCSF, and a number of other institutions to test new drugs in the breast cancer arena. Here, all of the infrastructure is put in place. So if an organization comes with a new potential therapy for breast cancer, it can be plugged directly into the iSpy network without going through the entire laborious process of negotiating the terms, dealing with 10 different IRBs, or in some cases 30 different IRBs, et cetera, to facilitate the process as quickly as possible. We are gratified to see many more strategic foundations really entering this drug development space on a much more strategic basis than they used to. So the Cystic Fibrosis Organization, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, Michael J. Fox Foundation, that we'll hear more from again later this morning, have all begun to say, it doesn't make sense for us to fund too much basic research and hope a miracle will happen. We better get involved in the direct process of seeing good clinical trials done and bringing good candidates to market. And so I think this emergence of foundations, not only as a funding source, they have financial resources, but as a sort of independent view of how this should be done, is a very important move in our field. And then finally, healthcare organizations themselves have to play a significant part in this. We have to make sure that new drugs are used responsibly, whether they're accelerated approval or special medical use. They have to be used in patient populations for whom the benefit and risk is clearly articulated and understood by the patients. And there's quite some amazing things going on in that space. Some of you, well, if you haven't seen it, you will. The Kaiser Permanente organization has now collaborated with UCSF to do a genomic study, a SNP analysis, on 100,000 Kaiser patients, many of whom have healthcare records that go back 25 years in the Kaiser organization. It's an enormously valuable, rich resource of patient information combined with the power of genomics. And I think that this kind of study will lead to much greater understanding of patients. For example, just as one example, people are concerned about statin intolerant patients in terms of getting their LDL levels lowered. Well, this study would allow you to look at least the genetics and genomics of a large statin intolerant population within the Kaiser organization to hopefully identify some fundamental reasons why those patients are intolerant to statins. That's just one example of how the data could be utilized. So that program the data are just beginning to be analyzed from that program, but I think are typical of what can happen now when providers and researchers actually collaborate in a meaningful way to move the field forward. So on that note, I'll close my remarks. Mark has agreed to ask me some questions first and then engage the rest of you no further beyond that. So, Mark, I guess you're going to come back up here and join me. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
We are going to continue this discussion and involve all of you momentarily while we get both of us connected to the microphones. I would like to remind you that we are going to ask for comments from all of you in just a few minutes. And Ed, I'll take it that you're sitting a seat down doesn't mean that
no, I just don't want to crowd you.
Got a lot of space between us on this. But let me start out with you did a great job of covering an entire spectrum of issues in the PCAST report and going beyond it. And we're going to hear some more perspectives on these issues from our panel in just a minute. What do you think about the progress that we're making so far? It sounds like a lot of steps are happening now. Maybe they've been encouraged, energized by the PCAST report. Are we seeing any results yet? Maybe to put a finer point on it, one of the metrics that people track in terms of how much innovation is really paying off for patients is the number of drugs that the FDA approves. And that's not just a function, as you said, of FDA regulatory actions. It's also a function of how productive the science coming in is. And although there was a kind of a big downturn over much of the past decade, we've seen an increase in the number of new drugs approved, including the so-called priority approvals for treatments for unmet medical needs in the last year or two. It was way up in 2011, seems to be on track for a higher level in 2012. Is that a sign that this transition to the new way of doing business is starting to pay off, that some of these steps are starting to pay off, or is there still a lot of reason for concern?
Well, both. You probably wouldn't be surprised at that answer. I do think the science continues to evolve. And so, especially in cancer now, the ability to interrogate tumors and to understand depthfully the metabolism of tumors and the various factors that are at work that cause tumor growth are leading to a whole new generation of targeted cancer therapies. So, that's an example where the field is moving rather quickly going forward because the tools to interrogate the disease have improved dramatically. And we have one of the leading people in that field, John Mendelsohn, who will be here later to talk about some of what's going on in that area. In other areas, it's very slow. Complex diseases like type 2 diabetes are difficult. They're just scientifically difficult, and there some of the new. It's not totally clear that you can link cause and effect as easily in that case of a complex disease as in cancer, as hard as the cancer problem still is. So I think the progress is mixed, but I'm optimistic that the field is moving in a good direction. But it requires the science and the clinical work to sort of converge. I think on the other hand, I think that the overhaul, if you will, of the clinical trials system in this country is just beginning. And it's one of our biggest challenges. How can we make it better, faster, cheaper? And people are beginning to worry about this, which is always, the first step in the problem is to recognize you have a problem. The problem exists in many different ways. First of all, many companies now are going overseas to do their clinical trials because of the cost here. Just for your information, a typical clinical trial in the United States now costs more than $100,000 per patient enrolled in the trial. All the costs all in. It's extremely expensive here, and it also goes too slowly. According to CTTI, 20% of the physicians who sign up in a typical clinical trial to do the clinical trial never enter a single patient. So there are a number of problems there that need to be fixed. I think the partnership idea, that the partnership for accelerating therapeutics, is a powerful notion, but it has to actually come to fruition. The fact that we have Howard Hughes and the National Academies both committed to make this happen, I think, is a very positive sign. Peggy Hamburg's enthusiastic response to this report. As I said, Peggy has not stood up and said, I agree to every one of these recommendations, but Peggy has stood up and said, We believe this is the right direction. We believe that special medical use in particular is an important new category that we should explore. So again, based on the limited understanding, I think a number of these things really are happening, Mark.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. So let me follow up on a few of those. Let's start with clinical trials challenges. You mentioned the work that Duke is doing with CTTI. You mentioned some of the emerging ongoing infrastructures for clinical trials. So it's not a one-off approach. There are multiple treatments that can be tested on an ongoing basis in multiple centers more efficiently. You also mentioned that NCATS, the new NIH center, had taken some new steps that you thought were very promising in terms of supporting more efficient clinical trials. Can you say a little bit more about that? And then about what still needs to be done aside from, or maybe it's just carrying out these initiatives further?
Well, Chris Austin's going to tell you a lot about that in a little while. But I do think, first of all, NCAT was controversial in the scientific community, no doubt, because people saw it as competing for funds for basic science. And so many of my colleagues at UC Berkeley, among other places, were not thrilled to see move towards translational medicine. But I think if you put the NCAT in the context of a regulatory science environment where you need to bring good science, what a clinical trial is a well-run experiment on human beings when you get down to it. So I think that NCAT is bringing the good science of NIH to this field. It's a little early days, I think, still to judge NCAT's effectivity, but certainly I think the goals are in the same direction as what we're saying overall. And NCATs can play a very important role. Personal opinion, I don't think NCATs can do this all by itself. It requires, again, an ecosystem, if you will, around clinical trials. The academic medical centers in this country have to buy into this. The whole issue of cost has to be addressed by introducing efficiencies, et cetera. So I think, NCATs can't solve all these problems, but by saying the country's largest organization chartered to solve health problems is making a real effort in this space, I think shines light on it, and NCATs will do a number of good things.
It is a new direction. If the follow-up is as you were describing, we'll talk more.
So the follow-up is key to all these things. I mean, I would hate to come back a year from now and see nothing has happened on any of these, which, is unlikely, but...
Well, so moving beyond clinical trials into many of the recommendations that dealt with the FDA, as you said, FDA not as the place where all of these decisions and all of the fate of biomedical innovation is determined, but maybe the place where regulatory science, I think was what you called it, or development science, the science going along with moving the treatments from early stage testing into, instead of safe and effective use the phrase a favorable risk-benefit ratio or a satisfactory risk-benefit ratio. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue for the American
not even
public,
your tongue.
Not even mine. And so getting that different standard in place for accompanying the regulatory science progress seems like it might be a challenge.
For sure, it's a challenge. I think it's a worthy challenge, though. I think to tell the American public that every drug the FDA approves is safe is misleading, because they're not safe. There is no such thing as a safe drug. Some are very toxic, as we know, and have been in use for years, et cetera. And they're only appropriate for use where their benefit outweighs their risks. And so to move the conversation even slightly in that direction, it seems to me, would be valuable, because it will impact the decisions made to actually approve those things for use in our population. If the targeted, it's the risk and the benefit for whom is the crucial question. And I didn't make up the term regulatory science. I think Peggy made it up, actually. But there's a new move towards what's called precision medicine, using the best medicine for the individual that you're treating. Every physician's tried to do that, of course, but the new tools that will facilitate that are coming along, but inevitably it will require the people to really address more squarely the issue of risk and benefit for the intended person. Down to
and is that a different approach then for the scientific development process? This seems like a big challenge for the FDA to take on on its own, given it's just as subject to the tighter fiscal environment as everyone else is, and it's facing an explosion, along with this move towards precision
a number
medicine
of things are happening.
of knowledge, right?
We may do a study of regulatory science at PCAST, because the term is now being bantered about broadly in this town without a clear understanding of what the term means. It's much broader than just the FDA, and because it's a problem for all new products which require some sort of approval, whether it's by the USDA, the FDA, the EPA, et cetera. You need to have a body of information which allows you to make a decision about whether this substance is ready for widespread use in our society. So it's an important, I'm a real believer in this, as you can start to tell. You want me to give another talk in regulatory science, I can do this, but after we do a PCAST report on the subject. But it's a different discipline than doing basic research. And I think that's what people need to get their arms around. Peggy's been a leader in that, but a number of academic institutions. I think FDA has sponsored a graduate program at LSU, if I remember correctly. Anybody from FDA can correct me. At a university to build a regulatory science department. UCSF is building a master's degree program in regulatory science. So there are a number of academic institutions stepping up to this field going forward. But it's a very different kind of work. You know, one example, I was a basic scientist early on in my career. You know what a basic scientist does when a problem gets too hard? Work on something else. No, it's true. But when a problem in developing a new chemical entity for widespread use in people emerges that's too hard, what do? You have to keep working on it. You have to figure out a way to get through the problem rather than avoid the problem. And basic scientists don't think that way. You don't last very long as a basic scientist if you plug away on a problem for too long without solving it. You soon find yourself out of a job. So it's a different discipline. And it's a much more disciplined approach to the science than basic scientists are used to. So it's a real gap, I think, and we point that out in our report. There's a real gap here for the professionalism of this work. Science, when it's applied to a regulatory scheme, you actually can articulate, and FDA is far ahead of most other agencies, exactly what needs to be determined in order to convince yourself that its benefit and its risk are appropriate to the patient you want to treat.
Right. We have time for a couple of questions from you all in the audience. There are microphones going around. If any of you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah, up here.
Hi, I'm Kevin Finneran at the National Academy of Sciences. I wonder if you looked sort of downstream at the regulatory process. I mean, one of the problems we face is that clinical trials can't possibly anticipate every occurrence that might occur when you go to a larger population. And one of the problems we have is then after something is approved and then we find out a problem, how we react to that and how we adjust to that. And so I wanted to know if you had looked at that at all. You had suggested going out in the sort of concentric circles, broadening populations is one way to introduce things gradually and improve on the clinical trial. But what happens when we do get out there, find that we've made a mistake, either an interaction or over a long period of time, a problem? Are there systems in place to improve that so that we don't just overreact and then make a mess of the system at that end?
Let me try to rephrase your question. If you had asked me, instead of did we make a mistake, did we anticipate all of the findings that emerge from a broad-based study in a larger population? We may not have, and that's, I think, the question you're asking. That doesn't necessarily mean it was a mistake to approve it, but it does sharpen your focus on the use that the medicine in this case is put to.
And evidence developed based on the
yes.
use.
And so, you know, the example, it's very hard to take a product off of the market once it's out there because many people who took the product believed it worked for them. And, you know, people don't want to hear any more about Vioxx, but there were a lot of people who swore that Vioxx was a better pain reliever for them than any other drug and may have been willing to take the risk of a cardiac event. I don't want to get into that too deeply. I can see Mark frowning already up here. But, but another example was Avastin for breast cancer. There are women today who believe Avastin may have saved their lives or at least extended their lives dramatically, although the data, when analyzed in its fullness, didn't show that for the group of patients as a whole. So Peggy made a very hard decision to remove from the Avastin label use in breast cancer, in advanced breast cancer. It's really hard to do once a drug is in the marketplace to take it back off. And there are other examples now where outcome studies have shown that drugs currently in the market don't have the outcome that people sought for the drugs, and therefore the basis of approval in a case of accelerated approval wasn't necessarily warranted because the outcomes of it. But the FDA faces a serious issue in taking things off the market because a large number of patients actually believe, in spite of the controlled experiments done to the contrary, that the medicine benefited them.
I do want to come back to this topic with Earl Steinberg on our panel in a few minutes. So time for maybe one more quick question now. Any others? All right, well, I'd like to thank Ed for joining us here today. Thank you very much.